So I believe we're covering a few time zones today. So good morning, good afternoon, and indeed good evening from Asia. I would like to start today's webinar hosted by ADM Capital Foundation by welcoming you to what promises to be an informative and insightful event. My name is Sophie Leclue, and I am the CEO of ADMCF. For those of you who don't know us, ADMCF is a philanthropic foundation committed to building environmental resilience in a changing climate. We have a particular interest in biodiversity and the intersection of development and trade. We are based in Hong Kong, a global trade hub with the busiest air cargo port and one of the busiest container ports in the world. We have observed some of the world's largest seizures of wildlife on our doorstep, and the city has become one of the leading importers of a diverse range of CITES listed species over the last decade. Hong Kong is a global leader in imports of live arowanas, live reptiles, tiger horns, crocodile meats, American ginseng, and red sandalwood, amongst others. So for us, CITES and its COP are extremely important, and we're delighted to host this event. The 19th COP is fast approaching, and as usual, the agenda is packed. It includes 42 animal and 10 plant proposals to amend Appendices 1 and 2. These proposals may be species specific, and in several cases cover entire and multiple families. Some will be controversial and be voted upon, and some will be agreed by consensus. Either way, the decisions made at COP19 will be crucial for the survival of many species. The COP19 agenda also covers a wide and diverse range of issues, which we will also address today. So if you're attending a CITES COP for the first time, today's webinar is designed to help you navigate the meeting to get the most out of it. If you've been to a COP before, the webinar offers an opportunity to brush up on the listing procedures, compliance, and enforcement issues. If you're an old hand, a CITES expert, as I know many of you are, you may be interested to hear our experts' views on the proposals and some of the challenging issues to be raised. Whether you are an observer, a party delegate, an interested party, we hope the webinar will be informative, provide guidance, and answer questions you may have. Today's lineup of speakers is unique in that we have experts drawn from a range of backgrounds, including those who've been at the coalface of the convention itself. And we're delighted to have former CITES Secretary General John Scanlon AO moderating today. John served at a time when we saw a significant increase in the level of political attention, public profile, funding, partnerships, and outreach of CITES. Now, before handing over to John, I'd just like to play a quick video as a reminder of why we're all here today.
Thank you, Sophie, and thanks for that film and for your generous introduction. And we're most grateful to the ADM Capital Foundation for hosting today's briefing and for ensuring it's presented in the 3 working languages of the convention. A quick reminder for everyone that you need to select your preferred language from the interpretation icon at the bottom of the Zoom page, as is shown in this screenshot. And you can switch between languages at any time. We are most grateful to our extraordinary lineup of expert speakers, each of whom you can see on this slide, for volunteering their time to be with us today. And thanks also to our wonderful 12 co-sponsoring organisations. A meeting at the Conference of the Parties to CITES, called a COP, can be quite intense, complex, and at times controversial. I certainly felt quite intimidated at my first CITES CoP in Doha in 2010, where I was introduced as the incoming Secretary General, especially after someone from an NGO came up and warmly welcomed me to CITES and then went on to tell me that he and others knew a lot more about CITES than I did. These CoPs are big events with many moving parts, and it's not always easy for CITES parties, observers, or the media to follow the entire agenda for a CoP and the various rules and practices that govern their consideration, especially if you've never been to one before. The agenda for CITES CoP19 to be held in Panama is no exception. It's a long and rather complex agenda. For that reason, we decided to come together to offer this expert briefing on CITES and CoP19 to assist parties and observers and the media understand how a CITES CoP works and the main issues that are up for consideration at CoP19. As Sophie mentioned, it's designed both for newcomers to CITES, in particular the early part of today's program, as well as for those who are familiar with the convention but want to get a sense of the main issues coming up at CoP19. And it seems to have resonated well, as we've had over 1,000 people pre-register for today's briefing, and we extend our thanks to everyone who has joined us live today. March 23 will mark CITES' 50th anniversary, and over that time it has gathered a deeply committed and knowledgeable group of observers who actively engage with the convention. A number of these organisations offer comments and recommendations on the agenda items, and for CoP19 we've already seen several detailed assessments coming out, including from the NGO Traffic and the Species Survival Network. The FAO Expert Panel on Aquatic Species and the CITES Secretariat have also offered their assessments. And I just noticed this morning that the EIA has also released its recommendations. All of these inputs are extremely helpful to parties in taking fully informed decisions, and they're all in the public domain. CITES attracts many differing and strongly held opinions, and our speakers come from a diverse range of organisations and hold differing perspectives on a wide range of issues. However, they are joined together by a shared commitment to the convention. And today our speakers will highlight key aspects of the agenda without lobbying for a particular outcome. Notwithstanding, it's inevitable that particular perspectives may come through from time to time, and that's the nature of CITES. CITES is a convention of the 1970s. It reflects the approach of its time. It's focused on a very specific issue, in this case, regulating international trade in wildlife to protect against overexploitation through international trade. And attempts over the years to have the convention address a wider range of issues, such as alien invasive species, climate change, and most recently zoonotic diseases, have to date not found much favour with parties, which have preferred to maintain the narrow focus of the convention. And that's a point of view held by a number of observers as well. Now, over the years, I've been asked a lot of questions about the fundamentals of CITES, and I'm going to address just 3 of them now, as it may help in setting the scene before we have a conversation with Jonathan Baillie, who will do a deep dive into how a CITES CoP works. Firstly, is CITES a United Nations convention? Contrary to some claims, CITES is not a UN convention. Its origins can be traced back to a resolution adopted in 1963 by IUCN at its General Assembly in Nairobi, Kenya. And it was finally negotiated and signed at a plenipotentiary conference convened by the United States in Washington, DC in March 1973, following a recommendation from the 1972 UN Conference on the Human Environment. It was called the World Wildlife Conference, a slogan the CITES Secretariat rediscovered in 2013 and has used at every CoP since that time. And since 2014, the 3rd of March, the date CITES was signed in Washington, DC, has been celebrated as UN World Wildlife Day. Does CITES promote or discourage trade? Now, I get asked this a lot, and we see many different perspectives amongst parties and observers on wildlife trade. But the convention itself neither promotes nor discourages trade. It's agnostic on the matter. Rather, CITES regulates trade in certain species, namely those listed in its appendices, to ensure the trade is legal and not detrimental to the survival of that species. States have sovereign rights to exploit their own biological resources, and the decision whether or not to allow trade is one for the country itself to determine, subject, of course, to meeting their international obligations, including those under CITES. Now, related to this, I'm often asked if CITES is a conservation, crime, sustainable use, or a trade convention. CITES is not a crime-related convention. As regards sustainable use, the term was not used at the time CITES was signed. It's found its way into international law and policy about 20 years later. It's a concept that has many elements, as is clear from the recently released IPBES assessments on sustainable use and on the values of nature. CITES regulates international wildlife trade in certain species to ensure it is not detrimental to the survival of that species. As you can see, the language of the convention tends to be in the negative rather than the positive. But if one turns the language around, it seeks to ensure any such international trade is sustainable. So what is CITES? It's both a conservation and a trade-related convention. It uses trade-related measures to achieve its conservation objective, namely protecting certain wildlife against overexploitation through international trade. And in doing so, it contributes towards achieving sustainable development. So what do we have planned for you today? Well, today's briefing will address proposed amendments to the CITES appendices, as well as the working documents. And even though we have a few hours set aside, it will simply not be possible for us to go through the entire agenda. And nor can we address many agenda items in great detail. Rather, we will flag key agenda items for your attention and offer our observations. So what's on the agenda for COP19? Well, the short answer is a lot. It's a packed agenda that includes the listing, uplisting or downlisting of many species, including amphibians, reptiles and trees. We also see a continuation of the trend seen since COP16 in Bangkok to bring more commercially harvested shark species under CITES trade controls. Elephant and rhino are back on the agenda once again, along with many other species-specific issues. Emerging issues such as specimens produced through biotechnology and taking a One Health approach to wildlife trade are on the agenda, as is a new proposal to amend the rules of procedure for the COP to introduce weighted voting. There are many agenda items on compliance and enforcement and on how to better regulate, review, and analyse legal trade. The implications of CITES for livelihoods, Indigenous peoples, local and rural communities has been on CITES CoP agendas for a long time now and is addressed through many decisions and resolutions. Several agenda items seek to take a slightly different direction from the past, with proposals put forward to create a new rural communities subcommittee and to amend CITES listing criteria to go beyond agreed biological and trade criteria to include consideration of livelihoods and food security. Now, all these issues and many more will be addressed by our expert speakers, who I will introduce individually as we come to them. And in the interest of time, I will only introduce our speakers by their current position, but you can find their full bios online. Now, we have a chat and a Q&A function. And when the speakers have finished, we will have an open Q&A session, drawing from questions included in the Q&A box, not the chat box, please, as you can see from this screenshot. And you are welcome to ask your questions in English, French, or Spanish, and we will endeavour to get to them, but if we can't, we will follow up with you after the event. And finally, just a quick reminder that we are recording today's event so that people who cannot join us live can still benefit from the briefing. Now, with that, we're going to move straight to our conversation with one of the world's leading CITES experts, our good friend and colleague, Jonathan Baillie, on CITES, how a CITES CoP works, and on his personal reflections on the agenda for COP19. So, Jonathan, welcome.
Thank you very much, John.
Now, do those photos bring back any fond memories?
Oh yes, brings it all flooding back, John. But actually, no, I actually had some fun, so it was good. All good.
Very good. Now, Jonathan, we're going to have a bit of a conversation here, and if my memory serves me correct, you've been involved with CITES for about 45 years now. And can you give us a brief snapshot of the many roles you've had with CITES over that time?
Well, I reckon it's 46, John, but who's counting? I actually, for me, it all kicked off in 1976 when I stopped being a zookeeper, and I started being a freelancer based in London. So the United Kingdom had just acceded to CITES at the time, or ratified CITES. So I was advising members of Parliament on new legislation to implement the convention. And so I was helping out a number of non-governmental organisations, in particular Traffic and Friends of the Earth. And that led a bit later on to me moving on to be Director of Traffic International, Head of the Wildlife Trade Monitoring Unit of the World Conservation Monitoring Centre in Cambridge, where we maintained the CITES trade database, amongst other things. I went from there to the European Commission, where I wrote the EU legislation to implement CITES, and then from the European Commission to the CITES Secretariat for 24 years, where I met you, John. And then leaving there, came back to being freelance again. So you see, it all went full circle.
Wow, that's amazing. Well, we've certainly got the right person here for this conversation in you, Jonathan. Now, Jonathan, you've been to many COPs, but this will be the first CITES COP for some people. Can you explain to us how a CITES COP works? What's the difference between the plenary, the two committees and working groups, and what do they all do?
Okay, good question. So everybody's seen the agenda. That starts off, the discussions of the agenda start off in a plenary session. That's where everybody's in the same room. And then in the plenary session, they handle some of the administrative issues, they elect chairs, they decide on which items are going to go to be discussed in various committees, which I'll come to in a second. They decide on the rules of procedure that are going to apply throughout the meeting and so forth. Number of administrative issues. And then they set up two big committees. So the whole meeting, actually the bulk of the meeting, takes place in two different rooms. One is committee one room, where they discuss the scientific issues and the amendments to the appendices. And then there's the committee two room. Committee two discusses the administrative issues, the budgetary issues, legal issues, and so forth, technical matters as well. And then those committees, they have to report back to the plenary, and with a recommendation. So the final decisions, the stamp of approval, is given in the plenary session back at the end of the meeting again. So that's how it works, more or less.
Okay, very good. And Jonathan, what rules govern the proceedings of a COP, and when and how are they adopted?
Okay, well, I know you know the answer to all these questions, John, so but for people who haven't attended these meetings before, obviously, the rules of procedure then are adopted at the beginning of every meeting of the Conference of the Parties, and it's just to set the ground rules so that the meeting can finish on time, so people know where they have to sit, how they vote, what's the quorum that's required, what's the majority that's required for making decisions and so forth. So a lot of these rules, which actually anybody who's attending the meeting should read in advance, so they know exactly how it's going to work and when they can ask for the floor and who will give them the floor and so forth. So that's the rules of procedure. As I say, they're adopted at every meeting just to make sure that the meeting goes smoothly and that everything can be finished within the time available.
Yeah, no, good advice to familiarise yourself with them as well, Jonathan. And Jonathan, we've seen that the agenda has been posted online. Yep. Can parties still add new items to the agenda for COP19, or is it too late now?
It's too late. There's a deadline of 150 days before the meeting to submit proposals for the meeting. It is possible, however, if there are really urgent matters that come up, the Secretariat can actually add items to the agenda before the COP starts, or during the meeting. There's a bureau, which is a group of the parties that meets together at the beginning of every day to make sure the meeting goes smoothly. So the bureau, they can add an item to the agenda if it's really urgent during the meeting, yeah. But otherwise it's closed.
Okay, and Jonathan, the agenda refers to the adoption of the agenda, and of the working program. What's the difference between the two, and how does one know when and where a particular agenda item will come up?
Okay. So the agenda is just a list of the topics that are going to be discussed by category, and a list of all the proposals that have been made by category. It's more or less an order of related items. And they're going to be discussed, but not necessarily in that order. So the working program is to give you an idea of the order in which they're going to be discussed and how they're divided between some items going to be discussed only in the plenary, some in committee 1 and some in committee 2, which I described already. And it's to give the participants a bit of an idea about roughly the order in which things are going to come up. So you have an idea about when your items might come up during the discussion, but items can go fast or slow. So there's no guarantee it is going to come up on a particular day. You need to keep following the evolving working program.
Okay. And Jonathan, we also see some reference to information items. What are they and what status do they have at a meeting?
Well, the parties or observers can submit information documents. If they come from the parties, they might be posted on the website. Ones from non-governmental organisations generally will be put on the tables outside or on their own websites. They can be any information document that addresses the conservation, protection and management of species. They have no status in the meeting at all, so they've got no formal status. They can be referred to in the discussions, but they're not presented for adoption. It's just for information and to help to keep people informed about the items that are going to be discussed, so the best decisions are made.
Okay, very good, John. And the agenda refers to draft decisions, resolutions, proposals to amend the appendices, to list, uplist or downlist species, and to amend or remove annotations. Now, this can get a little bit confusing for newcomers. Could you explain the difference between decisions, resolutions, and the appendices, and what annotations are?
Okay, let's take them in that order then. So the decisions, those are, generally speaking, instructions given by the Conference of the Parties to some of the conference bodies, to the Standing Committee, to the Secretariat, the Animals and Plants Committees. They're generally speaking short-term instructions to be implemented and then to be deleted afterwards, usually at the following meeting. The resolutions adopted by the Conference of the Parties are, generally speaking, long-term interpretations of a convention, guidance given to the parties and how to interpret the convention and how to implement it to improve the effectiveness of the convention. So those are long-term, and they also include items such as the budget. The appendices actually form a part of the text. Well, first of all, I should say decisions and resolutions. They're made in the context of what's allowed under the text of a convention, which allows the Conference of Parties to make recommendations. So they are effectively recommendations, they're not binding. Whereas the appendices, which list species that are going to be covered by the convention, those are part of the text of a convention, and therefore they are legally binding, like the text of a convention. So in Appendix 1, 2, and 3, those are where the species are listed. I think everybody knows. I don't need to go into that in any particular detail. There's also an Appendix 4, which is a sample permit, but that's been more or less superseded by a resolution. So the proposals that are coming forward are to list or to list species for the first time, or to move them up or down. That's up to Appendix 1, down to Appendix 2. Or sometimes to delete species from the appendices altogether. A proposal to list the species can sometimes indicate that just a particular population or particular subspecies that's being listed. And those are generally indicated by an annotation in the appendices to show that it's just a particular part of the species, not the entire species.
Mm-hmm. Oh, very good. So annotations are part of the appendices and a part of the legally binding framework of the convention.
Yes, they are. The annotations can actually also indicate sometimes other kinds of information, such as export quotas for the species that are being listed, additional information such as that, or in some cases, they can also indicate the types of specimens that are covered or expected to be controlled.
Interesting. And Jonathan, we hear reference sometimes to a split listing, and we see that coming up on this agenda. Is this something that happens often, and what does it mean?
Yeah, it happens a lot. There are dozens of split listings in the text, in the appendices. Let me just explain that quickly. So the text of a convention allows for including species in Appendix 1 or 2 or 3. The Conference of the Parties only deals with 1 and 2. The text of the convention also defines the word species to mean species or subspecies or geographically separate population. So sometimes if a subspecies is included and then in some other one appendix and another subspecies is in another appendix or not in the convention at all, the same with geographically separate populations, that's called a split listing when they're in different appendices or one is listed and one is not listed. And as I say, there's lots of cases like that in the appendices.
Thanks, Jonathan. And Jonathan, we hear about reservations. What is meant by entering a reservation?
So when a state becomes a party to convention for the first time, it can specify particular species which it doesn't want to cover. So it doesn't want to control the trade in those species. So it takes out what's called a reservation. It tells the depository government that it's making a reservation against those species, which effectively means that it's not a party to the convention with respect to trade in those species. So they can do that at the time they become a party. And the other time they can enter a reservation is when an amendment is made to the appendices. So after a meeting of the Conference of Parties, they've got 90 days to enter a reservation against the amendment. And again, what the text of the convention says is if you enter a reservation against that amendment, you're not party to the convention with respect to trade in that species.
Okay,
but so I should just say that nonetheless, some countries make a reservation, but then control the trade anyway. They just don't want to have to be obliged to have to do so.
Okay. Now, Jonathan, we've talked about the agenda, but how is an agenda item introduced at a COP? Who introduces it? Who can speak? And is it resolved immediately, or is there more to it?
So the way it works is that usually a proponent country or the secretariat, whoever puts forward the document, that's the country or the secretariat that will be invited to present the document. And then what they could do is say, if we're not present at the meeting, so they ask the chair to ask another country to present it for them. But the chair is then trying to find the best way forward. So the chair will then make an effort to find out what are the issues, who's in favor, who's against, what are the problems that have to be resolved. And the job of the chair is to try to obtain a consensus among all of those who are present in the room. If the chair can't do that, then they have to, for example, send the document off to a working group to discuss those issues. So they might select a number of countries, those who have expressed their concerns about the document and those who have put it forward in the first place, to try and resolve the problem between them and to come back with a proposal to the plenary or to the committee. And then if they still can't agree, then the chair will then have to put it to a vote.
Okay. Well, John, let's move on to that question of voting then. You know, one thing that people always talk about is CITES is a voting convention and only parties to the convention can vote. But how and when do parties vote in committee or plenary? And are the votes public or secret, and what majority is required?
Well, so the time when they vote is when you can't agree on a consensus. In general, the votes are open. So the voting takes place usually by electronically or otherwise by show of hands, depending what's available at the conference centre at the time. Any party can, if they think it's a really sensitive issue, they can request a secret ballot to be taken. And in those cases, if the one that's requested a secret ballot is seconded by 10 other countries, then it will be a secret ballot that's deciding on the matter, doing the vote. For the majority, if it's a procedural issue, then it's decided by a simple majority. just the half plus one of those present and voting. If it's a substantive matter, so for example, adoption of a draft resolution or amendment of the appendices, then that requires a 2/3 majority of the countries that are present in the room and voting at that time. Did that answer the question? I think so. Yeah.
Very good. No, very helpful, Jonathan. And Jonathan, as you know, better than anyone, CITES has many passionate observers, and very passionate and knowledgeable, I should add. Now, how can observers actively participate in a COP? And are there any limitations on observers' involvement in a COP?
Those organisations that want to be observers, they have to apply 60 days in advance. So if you haven't applied, it's too late to do so now. Okay. But even so, you can come to the meeting and you can sit at the back of the room as a visitor, but you can't then participate in the meeting, you can't intervene. But if you have registered an observer, you can ask to take the floor during the meetings of Committee 1 and Committee 2 and the plenary session. Generally speaking, NGOs try to avoid taking the floor during the plenary session and make their remarks during the Committee 1 and Committee 2. In any case, because there's an attempt not to reopen issues during the plenary session if they've already been discussed in the committees, discussed and agreed in the committees. But I think it's recognized by everybody that NGOs play a hugely important role. They've got a lot of good information, and a lot of them do a lot of research. So they present information in their information documents, but also on the floor. They take the floor. The chairman, if he's got time, will give the floor to NGOs. Can't always take all of the NGOs who've requested the floor, just because there isn't time usually. There's a huge time pressure. But they're admitted to those committees in the plenary session, and they're admitted also to the working groups, provided that they don't outnumber the parties in the working group. But when a working group's created, it's up to the chair of the session where it's created to decide on who's going to be a member of that group. Okay, great. Now, Jonathan, you've attended many COPs in many different capacities, in particular with the Secretariat. How does the agenda for COP19 compare to other COPs? Is there more or less items on the agenda? Is it pretty standard, or is there anything in particular that catches your eye? The first thing that catches my eye is getting longer and longer, these meetings, these agendas, the 91 items on the agenda. That's not to mention that one of those items covers all of the appendices, all the amendments to the appendices. So just the length is huge. And then there's a couple of things that catch my eye. I mean, it's good to see some of the species proposals coming back and some new ones. But in terms of other types of items, my eye was drawn to the initiative to review species list in Appendix 1. I think that's an interesting initiative. Hasn't been done for a long time. There's an initiative to call for a World Wildlife Trade Report, and I like the look of that. That's to ask for a report on the prices of species for sale, patterns of trade, a full report on how the trade is developing, to report back on an annual basis. I think that looks like an interesting initiative. And the third thing that caught my eye, because it's responding to recent developments, is a look at the specimens produced through biotechnology. Of course, biotechnology didn't exist much when the convention was created in the 1970s. So that's an interesting development. And of course, there are some very topical items, such as the look at the response to COVID and to zoonosis. Yeah, no, it's a fascinating agenda. And Jonathan, you've been to many COPs. We're benefiting from your wisdom today. But what is your advice to newcomers to CITES? How can they best get involved in COP19 without either feeling intimidated or overwhelmed? Well, the first thing that comes to mind when you ask that question is that everybody's on the same side, even if we've got different perspectives. I mean, there's those who lean towards the wildlife use perspective, and others who lean towards the wildlife protection perspective, and others in the middle. But everybody's effectively on the same side to try and ensure that species are conserved, and that if there's any use of species, that it's sustainable and minimizes the impact on the population. So don't be intimidated. Try and get your information out, if it's an information document, or ask for the floor, or otherwise, if you can't manage to get on the floor because there's not sufficient time, make sure you talk to people in the corridors. Don't be intimidated. Everybody's there to try and achieve the same goals.
Here, great advice, Jonathan. And Jonathan, I'm going to wrap it up with one final question. As you know, March 3 next year is the 50th anniversary of CITES, and it's also going to be the 10th anniversary of observing UN World Wildlife Day. And you and I worked on that together at COP16 in Bangkok. Yep. Now, my final question to you is one that gets posed to both you and I many times, and that is, in your view, has CITES been a success?
It's a good question. I'm asked that sometimes. To cut the answer short, simply put, John, I think the answer is yes. Mostly because I think what would be the world like if CITES didn't exist? It's not perfect. It's very far from perfect. But if I look at what the world would be like without it and what wildlife would be like without it, I think the world's a much better place with CITES than without it.
Great. I agree with you, Jonathan. And Jonathan, we're going to have to wrap up our conversation there, but you know, you've got such deep experience in the convention from every perspective, and what a fantastic way to get our session underway today, hearing from you. And we're very much looking forward to seeing you back at Q&A session, and thanks again.
I'll see you later. Thank you very much, John. Thanks for the opportunity.
See you soon. Thanks, mate.
Cheers. Bye.
All right, colleagues. With that, we'll now move on to explore the COP19 agenda in a little more detail. We're delighted to welcome Craig Hoover and Olivia Schwack-Goldman. Craig is Executive Vice President with the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, and Olivia is the Executive Director of the Wildlife Justice Commission. And Craig and Olivia are going to take us through legal issues, rules of procedure, criteria for listing, and compliance and enforcement issues. And we could not have two better people to guide us through these critically important agenda items. Now, Craig is going to get us underway, and then he's going to pass over directly to Olivia. With that,
thank you to the ADM Capital Foundation for hosting this webinar. It's great to see so much interest in CITES, a topic that has been near and dear to me for, I almost hate to say it, almost 3 decades. Olivia and I are going to cover 3 thematic areas of the COP agenda, which includes items that will be covered in plenary, Committee 1, and primarily Committee 2. All told, legal, regulatory, and compliance and enforcement issues make up more than 30 separate agenda items for COP19. We're going to touch on just a handful of these issues that we believe warrant particular attention and discussion. I'm going to use my brief time with you in this section to touch on these 7 agenda items or sub-items, which meet my criteria of being particularly novel, controversial, or fundamental to the effective function of CITES. I'll start with one of 2 rules of procedure documents that will be taken up in plenary session on the first day of the COP. This document, 4.2, has been submitted by Botswana and Zimbabwe, and proposes a weighted voting system for listing proposals and species-related resolutions and decisions. Specifically, the document proposes to amend Rule 26 to state that when deciding on proposals for amendment of Appendices 1 and 2 and related resolutions and annotations, the COP shall assign a number of votes per representative of the party proportionate to the population size of the species under discussion or whose status is subject to voting. Parties with larger populations would be allocated more votes in comparison with parties with smaller populations, using a formula to be decided by the COP. Now, we could spend the rest of this webinar discussing the legal and practical implementation issues surrounding this proposal. The treaty itself does not appear, at least to me, to contemplate anything other than a one-party, one-vote formula. How would one determine the population or geographic proportionality of a wide-ranging but not well-studied species, of a marine species, of a migratory species? The implementation challenges of this proposal are seemingly endless. But I'd rather raise 2 separate points. The first is that this proposal is born out of a long history within CITES of some countries feeling disenfranchised, marginalized, and imposed upon by other countries. of inordinately bearing the cost of decisions that they did not support. You can look across the agenda for this COP and find examples of these concerns rising to the surface. And though this document may not be the right vehicle for this issue, these concerns need to be addressed. A second and unrelated issue is that complicated and divisive rules of procedure issues can have a significant negative impact on the effectiveness of a COP, as the rules guide the COP and the COP can't conduct its business without agreed rules in place. So hopefully this issue will be addressed expeditiously on the first day of the meeting. My second agenda item, document 8, focuses on a language strategy for the convention. CITES, like several other treaties that began in the 1970s, has 3 working languages: French, English, and Spanish. There has over time been a push to expand to all of the working UN languages, including Arabic, Chinese, and Russian. Expansion would create a more inclusive convention. It would also add significant cost burden on an already financially challenged secretariat that would most likely have to be met by increased contributions from the parties. Document 8 presents 4 alternative options for expanding fully or partially to 6 working languages, with the anticipated budget implications of each. Ultimately, the parties will have to weigh these budget implications and what would be gained against other CITES priorities. As Jonathan mentioned, one of the agenda items for this COP is on a World Wildlife Trade Report. South Africa submitted document 12, which focuses on further exploring the socio-economic benefits of regulated wildlife trade. The document calls on parties to consider submitting price information associated with their annual wildlife trade report submissions. It calls on the Standing Committee to develop a methodology for producing a World Wildlife Trade Report. And it calls on the Secretariat, subject to external funding, to produce such a report every 3 years. This submission highlights the perspective of some parties that legal, sustainable commercial trade in wildlife can be beneficial to conservation and to communities, and that perhaps there has not been sufficient focus on this area. Whether this perspective has strong support, and whether and how CITES parties can or will share such data will be among the issues raised under this agenda item. CITES can be such a powerful international agreement because, like few other treaties, it provides for decisive actions up to and including trade suspension for parties that fail to meet basic requirements. I won't go into the details of each document here, but I encourage you to review document 38 regarding national laws and the documents under agenda item 29 regarding compliance matters. These are 2 of a handful of ways that CITES handles serious inquiries into whether CITES requirements are being met. I would also note that these processes also often play out over very long periods of time. For example, more than 70 of the 184 CITES parties still have legislation that does not fully meet what is required by the convention. Some of these parties joined CITES decades ago and remain able to trade in CITES listed specimens, despite this inadequacy. And yet, without these processes and the threat of suspension of trade, we would not likely see the substantial progress that we get with regard to national laws, reporting, non-detriment findings, enforcement, stockpile management, and other actions to ensure that CITES requirements are met and that trade is conducted legally and sustainably. Document 47 on specimens produced through biotechnology proposes to amend Resolution Conference 9.6 on trade in readily recognizable specimens. Trade in readily recognizable parts and derivatives to include specimens produced through biotechnology as readily recognizable and thus governed by CITES requirements under certain circumstances. This document lays out an additional series of draft decisions to further examine what is an increasingly complicated issue. On a good day, CITES is a complicated treaty with a vast array of implementation challenges. Specimens produced through biotechnology, 3D printing, cloning, synthetic reproduction, etc., will only make effective implementation of CITES more challenging. These technologies can serve as cover for illegal trade in the real products derived from wild specimens. But these technologies can be beneficial as well, potentially serving as a supply of specimens that removes pressure on wild populations. This issue bears close watch as technologies continue to blur the lines between what is and what is not a CITES specimen. As those of you who have worked in and around CITES for many years know very well, the criteria for amending Appendices 1 and 2 is perhaps the most divisive and controversial topic at a COP. At COP19, we have two submissions that, to a large extent, demonstrate that divide and return us to the observations I made with the first document I covered regarding rules of procedure. Here we have a submission from Botswana, Cambodia, Eswatini, Namibia, and Zimbabwe, which seeks to insert livelihood and food security considerations and to raise the bar for the role of international trade as a driver of species decline. If adopted as submitted, it would substantially increase what must be demonstrated to list a species in the appendices. And it would seem to test the boundaries of the explicit language in Article 2 of the Convention. By contrast, Senegal's submission, which would revisit a carefully negotiated footnote in Resolution Conference 9.24 that interprets the term decline for commercially exploited aquatic species. It's the most important footnote in CITES. Specifically, this would provide a more precautionary approach to how we consider decline in the context of sharks, rays, and other cartilaginous fishes, noting that they tend to be slower growing and reproducing than most other commercially exploited aquatic species. If adopted, it would likely be easier to demonstrate that a cartilaginous fish species meets the criteria. In many ways, these two submissions demonstrate the very different perspectives that the parties, NGOs, IGOs, and other observers bring to a COP. I hope these topics have given you at least a flavor of the more challenging agenda items in the legal, regulatory, and compliance space. I'm going to turn it over to Olivia now to talk about some of the enforcement issues on the agenda. Olivia?
Thanks very much, Craig, and to John and ADM Capital for organizing this really incredible group of speakers that we have on a huge amount of topics. So we all have very limited time. I'm going to focus, indeed, as Craig mentioned, on working documents related to enforcement, as well as domestic mechanisms to prevent the illegal trade, the electronic system, because that has a relationship with enforcement, and also in the trafficking in cheetahs. And after that, I'm just going to offer one or two really quick thoughts on the relationship between CITES and the illegal wildlife trade. Can I have the slide, please? The next one, please. Yeah, so as you can see, there's a really just tremendous amount of possibilities of what we can talk about, but I'm really going to try and focus because we don't have much time. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So document 33 on enforcement matters. CITES regularly discusses enforcement matters. Obviously, with any treaty, enforcement is critical. It's not a really controversial issue, but it does help give parties more direction on emerging enforcement issues. So that's important, that they're thinking not only about what was a challenge, but what's going to be a challenge and where they're seeing these new issues emerge. And what's really interesting about this document 33 is that along with corruption, it focuses on financial investigations and anti-money laundering legislation. And this is a real lacuna in the fight against wildlife crime. So this is a really important addition. And parties are encouraged to ensure that corruption risk mitigation strategies are in place and that collaboration mechanisms are in place between CITES and anti-corruption authorities. And it also directs the Secretariat itself to work with IQWIC, the FATF, and EcoFil to provide the parties with guidance on AML measures and to promote the use of financial investigations into wildlife crime. And that's something that we see is really lacking. So it's great that focus is included here. The proposed amendment to Resolution 17.6 to include reference to the 3 guidelines prepared by UNODC on corruption related to wildlife, fisheries, and timber crime. And that, again, is important to reference work done by other international organizations and not just be totally internally focused, but to look at what work's done by others. That's really important. In terms of document 34, an annual illegal trade reports. This is a housekeeping document required of all parties to effectively report back to the Secretariat, but it calls for amendments to Resolution 11.17 to urge parties to use the template provided by the Secretariat. And while this may sound really sort of very detail-oriented and nitpicking, it's really important that reporting is done systemically. It's only when it's systemically done that we can have a real sense of what's happening. So if we're not doing it systemically, it hinders the understanding of CITES in terms of what's happening with the illegal wildlife trade. So this is an important issue, even though it does seem fairly routine. It also urges the parties to submit an annual illegal trade report to the Secretariat. And again, this is really important because through these annual reports, we get a much better sense of what's happening in the illegal wildlife trade. So again, the more information we have, the better we can analyze it and see the trends that are emerging and what's working well and what's not working well. Document 35, the Task Force on Illegal Trade in Specimens of CITES listed tree species. Now, task force are incredibly important. So this is really, an important possibility that the CITES regime has to have these task force. And it's important that this task force stays on track and works with urgency. Its task force on the illegal trade in specimens of CITES listed tree species was convened after the last COP to develop strategies to combat illegal trade in CITES listed tree species. The proposal invites the COP to adopt draft decisions that first encourages parties affected by illegal trafficking in CITES listed tree species to implement the recommendations and activities developed by the task force, right? So not just to have these recommendations, but to get parties to actually implement them. And it also instructs the Secretariat itself to seek information from the parties on the implementation and to work with UNODC and the World Customs Organization Container Control Program to provide training on physical inspection of timber shipments in regions significantly affected by illegal trade in CITES listed species. So again, it's about implementation, and obviously what I'm talking about is enforcement. So it's absolutely key to have the mechanisms to implement the convention so that it can be enforced properly. Document 36 on wildlife crime enforcement support in West and Central Africa. There are actually 2 documents under this agenda item. And it's a really important item because West and Central Africa are hubs for the illegal wildlife trade. And to avoid displacement, a regional approach is essential. So crime displaces when you have better legislation and better enforcement. So we need to be looking at these issues as a regional and global approach. So this is a great initiative. The first document, document 36.1, is a report of the Standing Committee. And the draft decision directs the Standing Committee to establish first a working group to advise on procedures to enhance collaboration between parties along the supply chain. Again, not working in isolation, but working across the supply chain. And second, to create an intersessional working group to provide the West African Network to Combat Wildlife Crime, the WAN, with expert guidance and support. The second document under this agenda item is on the CITES enforcement support in West and Central Africa. This document was submitted by Cote d'Ivoire, the Gambia, Liberia, Niger, Nigeria, and Senegal. Now, these parties are highlighting the lack of tools to monitor changes in status in illegal trade. And they're saying they need help, they need capacity building in order to monitor this and to react to it. And they're concerned that the risk of extinction for species is affected by the international trade in the region. Now, these countries propose suggesting establishing 2 new mechanisms. The first is a creation of a CITES enforcement fund to support West Africa subregion, which this is a really new development and an interesting one. And for the second, to establish for the Plants Committee, a West Africa Timber Response Working Group to identify species at risk and support the development of tree species listing proposals, et cetera. So to really specifically on the West Africa timber issue within the Plants Committee. Document 37 on wildlife crime linked to the internet. This was prepared by the Secretariat. And the draft decision directs the Secretariat to commission a study to identify the CITES listed species most commonly illegally traded on the online platforms and to identify best practices to combat it. And the Secretariat invites the COP to amend Resolution Conference 11.3 on compliance and enforcement to promote the use of the Interpol's guidelines on wildlife crime linked to the internet. And it is important to keep in mind there are a lot of other initiatives already out there on illegal wildlife trade online, including not only Interpol's, but the Coalition to End Wildlife Crime Online, Traffics, IFAW, WWF, GTALK, ACA, and the WJC also. Next slide, please. Doc 38 on demand reduction to combat illegal trade was submitted by the Standing Committee. Now, wildlife crime needs to be tackled holistically, and demand reduction is absolutely essential in this regard. The draft decision directs the Secretariat to promote the CITES guidance on demand reduction strategies to combat the illegal trade and to support parties regarding its implementation. And parties are encouraged to make full use of the guidance. And again, this is really about going to the source of where the demand is and making sure that we're addressing that in a systemic way. So we have these guidelines and this guidance, and parties should be encouraged to use it. Document 39 on domestic markets for frequently illegally traded specimens was submitted by the Standing Committee. And it's crucial that legislation criminalizes trafficking and that enforcement efforts are enhanced. And specimens from domestic markets or stockpiles often leak into the international trade. So this is why this is so important, because it's about domestic markets, and CITES, as you know, addresses the international trade, yet the domestic markets have a big impact on the international trade. So that's what document 39 is addressing. Now, the draft decision directs parties to amend Resolution Conference 11.3 on compliance and enforcement to include additional actions to promote enforcement, namely to evaluate and amend, if appropriate, domestic measures and national legislation to adequately address wildlife crime. The decision also directs the Standing Committee to consider developing further guidance regarding the possession of specimens of Appendix 1 and Appendix 2 species, subject to a zero export quota. Document 41 on electric systems and information technologies and authorization of control permits was submitted by the Standing Committee. Now, electronic systems and permits are really important to avoid fraud and corruption. The more sophisticated we get in our compliance and enforcement mechanisms, the harder it is to get around them. So the Secretariat conducted a study on permit authentication and control. And what they found is really diverging practices by parties regarding the implementation of CITES permitting requirements. In fact, they found that nearly half the parties surveyed didn't include security stamps on their permits. And it's not always clear whether parties follow established policies and procedures when following risk-based assessments to decide whether to conduct physical inspections. And that's so important. How do you know which specimens you should look at physically and which you can just go based on the permit? So this is really important. The Standing Committee proposed draft decisions on the use of the electronic permit information exchange and recommends collaborating with the World Customs Organization regarding risk assessments and analysis. Document 44 concerns identification of materials. Identification of species by relevant agencies, for example, customs and law enforcement agencies, is essential for the enforcement of the convention. And there are two documents related to this. The first is 44.1 on the review of Resolution Conf 11.19, which was prepared by the Standing Committee. And it invites the COP to adopt a new resolution on species identification. And it aims to develop identification materials, including key elements to identify species and specimens thereof in the trade. And again, you need to be able to identify which species it's illegal to trade in or what trade is limited in. If you can't identify them, you don't know that you're seeing a violation of the treaty. So this is really important that these species identification mechanisms are up to speed and are constantly evolving. The second document is 44.2 on the identification of timber and other wood products. Now it's submitted by the Plants Committee, and it directs the Secretariat to develop a digital repository of timber identification resources, again, making it easier to access through a digital repository. And the outcome of the task force on illegal trade in specimens of CITES listed tree species that we talked about a minute ago in document 35 will also be relevant to this work. So a lot of these enforcement issues are connected to each other. Finally, the illegal trade in cheetahs. This was submitted by Ethiopia, and it summarized efforts by CITES to curb the cheetah trafficking. And Ethiopia is concerned that cheetahs will go extinct in the coming decades if no important action is undertaken. And it asserts that cheetahs are often falling through the cracks in the CITES process. So Ethiopia and Somalia recommend that the COP ensures that the Big Cat Task Force include clear and specific recommendations to curb illegal trade in cheetahs, and it directs the Secretariat to invite Interpol to support source, transit, and destination parties to combat cheetah trafficking. Next slide, please.
Olivia, we'll just have to wrap it up pretty quickly. If you could just bring it to a conclusion, that'd be fantastic.
Exactly, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. It's the last slide, and just to say, many documents presented make reference to support of other international organizations, whether it's UNODC or IQIC or World Customs Organization. And this is really important because CITES is a trade convention, and it's not always the best fora for addressing transnational organized crime. And CITES should seek to rely on its colleagues in other international organizations rather than necessarily duplicate that work. And while it's really important that CITES continues to bring to the forefront the issue of legal on its fellow organizations in order to make the best use of their expertise. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Craig and Olivia. That was really interesting. We could have gone on a lot longer, and there's clearly a lot for the parties to contemplate regarding these issues. So thanks very much for taking us through a heavy agenda in such a concise way. Now, before we move on to our next session, where we're going to explore various proposals to amend the appendices. Now, for our next session, we have 3 expert speakers who will explore a number of the proposals to amend the appendices, in particular as they affect terrestrial species. And I'm delighted that we're going to start with Dr. Winnie Kiru, one of Africa's leading wildlife conservationists and Director of Government Affairs with the EPI Foundation. And Winnie will take us through the various proposals for elephant, hippopotamus, and white rhinoceros. Winnie, over to you.
Thank you very much, John. Good afternoon from Nairobi. I'm sure some of you are in other time zones. I will quite kindly request that you share my screen. I'm going to be talking to you about some of the terrestrial species. I can't cover all of them, but I'll try and cover the big ones. So I'll go straight into proposal 4. This is African elephant proposal. The proponent is Zimbabwe. And we're looking at a proposal to amend annotation 2 pertaining to elephant populations of Botswana, Namibia, South Africa, and Zimbabwe. Now, the text of the current annotation has not been amended since COP14. And those amendments that those of you who have been to COPs remember were actually the opportunity to trade in ivory, and it was restricted to the so-called one-off sales. So this proposal requires the amendment of annotation 2. And have we had similar proposals? Yes, in COP17, we had proposals to amend the annotation. COP18, and you can see on your screen what the voting patterns looked like. Now, the proponents of this proposal would seek to delete these restrictions and really just have open trade in government-owned ivory stocks and end the moratorium on trade in government stockpiles. And there seems to be no clarity on how future trade in raw ivory will be conducted after these amendments. So this proposal will probably attract a lot of attention. Shall we go on to the next slide, please? This is proposal 5. Proposal 5 is a proposal by Burkina Faso, Equatorial Guinea, Mali, and Senegal. It proposes the inclusion of all populations of African elephant in Appendix 1 through the transfer of from Appendix 2 to Appendix 1 of the populations of Botswana, Namibia, South Africa, and Zimbabwe. Now, the proponents assert the elephants meet the criteria for Appendix 1. We all know that elephants made it to Appendix 1 during in 1997, and since then, these populations of Botswana, Namibia, South Africa, and Zimbabwe were downlisted during COP10 and COP11. Have similar proposals to uplist this populations been seen at COP? Yes, indeed, COP17, COP18, these proposals came up, and you can see the voting patterns then. The opponents assert that these 4 populations do not meet criteria for Appendix 1. And during COP17, we had indications of one of the Namibia's saying that they intended to invoke an article in the convention that would have them enter a reservation. So this is another set of proposals that will probably gain quite a lot of interest at the COP. So I quickly now look at proposals around the white rhino. There are 2 proposals. Proposal 2 seeks to transfer the population of the southern white rhino of Namibia to Appendix 1, from Appendix 1 to Appendix 2. And the annotation, I won't be able to read it just now, but you can refer to the documents that are circulating to see what the annotation that is being proposed here. Now, a similar proposal was rejected during COP18. 39 parties voted in favor, 82 parties against. Now, some of the issues that come up is that, the illegal killing of rhinos continues, and the signaling effect for opening any trade continues to be a real threat. But Namibia considers her population to be a population that meets criteria for Appendix 2. This is another one that is going to raise quite a lot of interest at the COP. We then have another proposal by Eswatini. This relates again to the southern white rhino, and the removal of the existing annotation on the Appendix 2 listing of Eswatini's population. Again, these proposals have been seen at COP, and the votes have been, as you can see, it seems unclear from the various groups that have reviewed these proposals. It seems quite unclear of the precautionary measures that will be taken if this removal is actually done, if the annotation is removed in total. So again, a proposal to watch. So I want to speak about the hippo. You have probably heard that there is a proposal by Benin, Burkina Faso, Central African Republic, Gabon, Guinea, Liberia, Mali, Niger, Senegal, and Togo to transfer the hippopotamus to Appendix 1 of CITES. The proponents assert that the species meets criteria for Appendix 1 because it shows a marked decline in the population size in the wild. It's affected by international trade, and the low reproductive rates of the hippo plus increased habitat loss continue to be a serious threat to hippo populations. The opponents assert that the population declines affect only some populations. They say others are stable and increasing, and the trade in the hippopotamus does not, is sustainable. So again, this will be another interesting proposal to watch. There are other proposals on terrestrial species, and I suggest that those who have not been to COP before, please look at the various documents that are circulating in the public domain and read more details about these various proposals. Thank you, John. I think that is all I wanted to say this afternoon.
Great, thank you, Winnie, and a really insightful overview, Winnie. And thanks for putting these proposals into a historical context. I think that's very helpful, in particular for those who are coming to the COP for the first time. Now, there are a number of proposals on amphibians and reptiles, and we're delighted that Dr. Michael Lau, a well-recognised expert in this field and a member of the IUCN Turtle and Tortoise Specialist Group, is able to be with us and take us through what various parties are proposing. Over to you, Michael.
Thank you, John. Let me share the slides. Right. I studied reptile amphibians, and I have helped in reviewing some of the appendices proposals before, and also giving input on the working documents. So in these very brief sessions, I will first talk about the reptile proposals in this COP, and then the amphibian proposals and one case study. I wouldn't have time to cover all of the proposals because there are in total 26 of them. So I'll just do some quick analysis to give you a flavor of different proposals, different groups, and different users that contribute to the international trade in these reptiles and amphibians. So for reptile proposals, there are 23 of them. 3 of them are actually uplisting from Appendix 2 to Appendix 1. And 4 of the proposals are downlisting from Appendix 1 to Appendix 2, and 2 with 0 quota for wild specimens. And 16 are new proposals, 1 straight to Appendix 1 listing, 14 to Appendix 2 listing, and 1 proposal actually covered 1 genus of turtles, so including quite a number of species. So only the 2 most threatened ones are proposed to be listed in Appendix 1, and the rest in Appendix 2. And I'll talk about more later in the case study. So a quick analysis of the different reptile proposals. You can see they include a different group of reptiles. For the crocodilians, the crocodiles and caimans, there are 3 proposals for downlisting from Appendix 1 to Appendix 2. And there are 6 lizard proposals, new proposals, for Appendix 2 listing and 1 for Appendix 1 listing. And there are 2 snake proposals, 1 actually downlisting from Appendix 1 to Appendix 2. This is because the Puerto Rican boa is not heavily traded internationally, and also the specimens involved, quite a large number of them are from captive breeding animals. So that's why the proposal is to downlist it from Appendix 2 to Appendix 1. And 1 new proposal is for the timber rattlesnake to be listed in Appendix 2. And there are 12 turtle proposals actually covering 55 species, because some of the proposals deal with the entire genus, some deal with 2 or 3 different species. So among these turtle proposals, 3 are uplisting from Appendix 2 to Appendix 1, including 2 Indian river turtles and softshell turtles, and also the Indo-Chinese box turtle to be uplisted to Appendix 1. And 8 are new proposals for Appendix 2 listing, and 1 covering the entire genus that I mentioned before for both Appendix 1 and Appendix 2 listing. So reptiles are a very diverse group, and if you look at the uses, again, different animals are for different use. For instance, the crocodilians, they're mainly for the skin trade, but for a lot of the commercial species, there are breeding farms successful already. However, while individuals are still vulnerable to be collected for the stock in breeding farms, or sometimes the eggs are collected to be hatched out for the trade. And for the lizards, as seen in this round of proposals, they are for the pet trade, and they include the colorful and bizarre-looking lizards. For the snakes, again, they are heavily traded for the pet trade, especially the colorful, the rare, and sometimes even venomous snakes are targeted for the pet trade. And most of the turtles are for the pet trade, and the rare ones are particularly sought after because there are collectors out there who are willing to pay a lot of money to acquire highly threatened species, highly restricted species, and even protected species. And some turtles are also traded for meat, and some for the shell as well. For the 3 new amphibian proposals, there are 2 frog proposals covering the entire glass frogs family, and also one with the lemur leaf frog to be included in Appendix 2, and one with 0 quota for the wild specimens of the lemur leaf frogs. And there's one new proposal for listing in Appendix 2 with 0 quota for wild specimens. All these 3 groups of amphibians, they are related to the pet trade. So I selected the Kinosternon, the mud turtles proposal as a case study because this group of turtles is actually quite diverse with 22 known species from North, Latin, and South Americas. And this proposal is actually from the 6 range states. As a group, they're threatened by over-collecting for the international pet trade, and also some of the species are popular food items locally. And the loss of wetlands and also casualties on roads, these are the threats. And from the trade record, we know that there are extensive illegal and unsustainable trade. And 2 of the species have recently been described. Kinosternon cora, only described last year, and Kinosternon voti, only described in the year 2018. And they are highly localized to Western Mexico, but already you can find them in the international market. There have been posts in the online forum selling them at a very, very high price. So the proposal is to have these 2 highly restricted species to be listed in Appendix 1. For the rest of the 20 species, some are vulnerable according to the IUCN Red List. Some are quite widespread and near threatened. Some not much is known about them, so they are data deficient. But as a group, it's not that easy to tell them apart. In the past, scientists usually use color marking to tell them apart, but that's not very reliable. So because of the look-alike issues, the proposals would like to ask the whole group to be listed under CITES so that it would be easier for the customs officials to separate the whole group from non-CITES species. And if you want to know more about the information, there's a lot of working papers, and I would be happy to answer any questions in the end. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. That was a lot to get through in a short space of time, and you did it brilliantly. And these are species that don't often attract the headlines, but they're just as important, and you quite clearly have a very personal passion for them as well. Now, finally, for this part of the program, I'm delighted to welcome back Craig Hoover. I introduced Craig earlier, so I won't do it again. And Craig is going to take us through the various plants proposals. Craig, over to you.
Thank you, Jen. There are 10 plant listing proposals that would be considered at COP19. Under CITES, as laid out in the definition of specimen in Article 1 of the treaty, plant listings in Appendix 2 or Appendix 3 can be annotated to include any readily recognizable part or derivative thereof specified in relation to the species. In other words, plant listings in Appendix 2 or 3 can be tailored to cover only certain types of specimens, such as logs, sawnwood, and veneer sheets for a timber-producing species. The use of annotations is beneficial in that it can limit the regulatory impact of a listing to only those parts or products, the trade of which is directly impacting the species in the wild, such as I noted, logs and sawnwood, but perhaps not musical instruments. However, annotations also are open to interpretation, to definition challenges and issues, and opportunities to circumvent regulation. For example, some modestly modified sawnwood, such as adding a beveled edge to what is otherwise raw wood material, can be a means of circumventing CITES controls for a listing that includes only logs, sawnwood, and veneer sheets. 2 of the 10 listing proposals, proposals 43 and 52, relate to amendments of annotations for existing higher taxon plant listings. One of the remaining 8 proposals, submitted by Brazil, proposes to uplist Pau Brasilia echinata, or Pernambuco, to Appendix 1 with an annotation for all parts, derivatives, and finished products, including bows of musical instruments, except musical instruments and their parts, composing traveling orchestras and solo musicians carrying musical passports in accordance with Resolution Conference 16.8. As I noted, annotations can be complicated. Interestingly, with regard to this proposal, Article 1 of the treaty and Resolution Conf 11.21, which interprets the treaty with regard to the use of annotations in Appendix 1 and 2, do not appear to contemplate a substantive annotation for an Appendix 1 listing, where that annotation identifies the specimens to be included or excluded from the listing. So this will be an interesting proposal to debate and discuss in Panama. Another proposal submitted by India and Nepal proposes to delist Indian rosewood, Dalbergia sisu, from a higher taxon listing of all Dalbergia species in Appendix 2, except for Brazilian rosewood, which of course is listed in Appendix 1. The proponents argue that the species is widespread and not threatened by trade, and that it can be distinguished from other rosewood species in trade. Thus, it does not meet the criteria, the listing criteria for Appendix 2. I'm fairly confident that the focus of discussion here will be whether or not, from a CITES enforcement standpoint, this species, when traded as sawnwood or other raw material, is easily distinguished in trade from other Dalbergia species. This proposal raises another interesting topic with regard to plants, and particularly commercially exploited timber species. Namely, such listings are often at higher taxonomic levels, at the genus level or family level, capturing not only the species found in trade, but many other species that are not known to be in trade, simply because they are or may be difficult to identify and may likely serve as substitutes if they are not also listed in the appendices. In fact, all of the remaining plant proposals are for higher taxon listings in CITES Appendix 2, all with annotations, and mostly involving commercially harvested timber species. There are at least a dozen other plant-focused documents on the agenda at COP19 covering a wide variety of CITES implementation issues. I'll cover just a few of them in the short time I have with you here. In recognition of the increasing number of commercially exploited timber species listed in the CITES appendices, the parties created the CITES Tree Species Program in 2017 with funding from the European Union and building on work done by the International Tropical Timber Organization. Over that time, the program has engaged in a wide array of projects supporting numerous CITES parties in forest governance efforts since its inception in 2017. The program is now at an inflection point with regard to funding and its future, and the CITES parties will be asked to consider the future of this capacity building work for the successful implementation of CITES tree species listings. There are several other submissions, mostly from the Plants Committee, related to taxon-specific issues, such as for rosewood, frankincense, African cherry, and agarwood-producing species, and for African tree species and neotropical timber species. Last, there are several documents related to annotations, including proposed changes to the interpretation section of the appendices, a proposal to explore development of an information system for trade and specimens of CITES listed tree species, and a proposal to explore the feasibility and requirements for developing an informal review mechanism of existing and proposed annotations. As I mentioned, annotations are complicated. Now I'll turn it back to John so that we can move from plants to marine species.
Great, thanks, Craig. And as you said, these plant proposals can be, very hard to get your head around, especially on the issue of annotations. And what you did was very clear and extremely helpful. So thanks for doing that. As you mentioned, we're now going to move to marine species. And marine species have become of increasing importance to CITES, especially for commercially harvested sharks. And there's someone who's been involved at the core of these issues for many years now, and that's Daniel Cashel-Rays, the Executive Director of Sea Shepherd Legal. And Daniel will be addressing marine issues, both the working documents and proposals to amend the appendices. And Daniel gets to have a full 20 minutes to himself. Daniel, over to you.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you to ADM Capital Foundation for making this briefing possible. Let me just quickly bring up my slides, and then, although I have 20 minutes, I will do my best to stick to them. As John said in the introduction, the purpose of this webinar is to inform, not to lobby. And I will give you an overview of marine and aquatic documents of CITES CoP19 and highlight some of the key documents. There's quite a lot of them. If any objective were to shine through at some point, it would be that of CITES long-term effectiveness for CITES for marine species, as a tool for marine species. Just very briefly, there's often a discussion about marine species being quite controversial in the context of CITES. It's important to note that the CITES scope has from the beginning included marine species. There are specific provisions since the inception of the convention, like introduction from the sea and a special consultation process for marine proposals that show that negotiators clearly had marine species in mind. But that said, listing for commercially exploited marine species tend to be among the more controversial proposals, and we'll discuss a few of them. Going one back here, at the bottom right, you can see that there's a large number of marine species that have been included in the convention for quite a long time. The numbers are largely driven by corals, but at the very right-hand side, you see a small uptick, and that is what we often talk about when we say CITES is moving more into the species that also have fisheries relevance. And the big watershed moment here was CITES CoP19 in 2013, where the first few big proposals of species that are commercially fished or interact with commercial fisheries were adopted by the CITES parties. That was only possible because in parallel, an operationalization of CITES provisions for introduction from the sea, that is take in areas from beyond national jurisdiction, was operationalized. And the lead in this discussion was Fabio Hazin, who's depicted at the bottom right corner, who sadly passed away last year, and I wanted to pay my respects to him. So overall, there's 6 proposals covering 108 aquatic species. 104 of these species are elasmobranchs, and 107 of them are Appendix 2 proposals. There's only 1 ornamental fish proposed for Appendix 1. There's also 12 working documents that primarily deal with aquatic and marine topics. And there are many more cross-cutting working documents, some of which have already been touched upon, that have a high relevance for these species groups. So diving in sort of as deep as it goes, probably the most controversial and most likely to be discussed, long discussed proposal on the marine side will be the requiem sharks. That's a proposal with 41 co-sponsors, 14 countries and the European Union. There are 56 species contained in the family. 2 of them are already CITES listed. That is the oceanic white-tip shark that was listed at COP16 and the silky shark at COP17. 19 of these species are proposed against criteria A and B of the resolution Conf 924 Rev COP17. And I agree with Craig saying that there is the most important footnote in CITES that applies to that specific discussion. And the remaining 35 species of the family are proposed as lookalike species. So why is that such an impactful proposal? The members of the requiem shark family feature prominently in fishes in trade. It includes, for example, the blue shark, which is the most commonly caught shark. For example, in the fin trade in Hong Kong, the 3 most commonly recorded species all hail from the requiem shark family. So a listing at the family level would bring the majority of shark fin trade under CITES Appendix 2 regulation, which of course carries its own benefits. But not all of the species that have a large share in the market are also the ones that are leading this proposal, in the sense that they're proposed for their decline or because they would otherwise become endangered in the wild. As I mentioned, CITES has specific consultation processes for marine species, and the responses to that are from what we call statutory consultees. One of them is the FAO expert panel. FAO puts together a panel of experts, and they found for the 19 lead species that 3 meet the listing criteria, 12 do not, and for 4 species there's insufficient data. On lookalike, the panel considered that listing the additional 35 species would have substantial implications far in excess of the requirements and impacts for the 19 lead species. IUCN Traffic, another statutory consultee, finds of the 19 lead species that 17 meet either Annex 2A or B, and the remaining 2 would be lookalike. Of the 35 species proposed as lookalike, all but 7 appear to meet the lookalike criteria for the listing. And this is going to cause some interesting dynamics, because the footnote that Craig already referred to in Annex 5 of the resolution offers some guidance on how to apply decline, but there's no equally detailed guidance on lookalike. Because such a significant part of the proposal is about lookalike species, that will be a very interesting discussion to follow at COP. There are also 5 other proposals. I won't go into them in detail in the interest of time, but I will note that they largely follow trends that we have seen at previous COPs. The first one, completing the listing of the hammerhead shark family, which is something that was recommended by the CITES Animals Committee and is supported by the statutory consultees so far. Then the other one is seeking to add a large family of endangered coastal shark species, which we've seen at the last COP as well. There is also additional sea cucumber species proposed, as well as ornamental fish. For the 2 ornamental fish proposals, it's worthwhile noting that the species concerned are already in Appendix 3 of the proponent country, Brazil, since 2017, and that commercial trade from the wild for these species is prohibited since 2021. Aquaculture from outside the country of origin supplies most of the international demand, and both statutory consultees question in some form or another if there would be additional conservation benefits from listing. Freshwater stingrays has been on the CITES agenda for quite a while, and previous proposals to list them on Appendix 2 were unsuccessful. Craig already covered that, so I get back some time, but maybe just to mention that one of the arguments that Senegal makes is that CITES shark listings tend to lag behind the adoption of fisheries prohibitions by RFMOs and domestic protections, which they argue indicates a misalignment between the intent of CITES Appendix 2 and the timing of listings. So yeah, as Craig mentioned, that this is a very carefully negotiated footnote, and the discussion will be tense and fascinating, I assume. Moving briefly to Introduction from the Sea. There was a survey prior to SC70 that found that parties were in relatively low compliance with Introduction from the Sea. And at COP18, a decision was taken for the Secretariat to continue to review this, as well as follow the negotiations of the internationally legally binding instrument on biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction that is currently taking place under a General Assembly mandate in New York. The document, the Secretariat's report, reports back on both of these issues, and the proposed decisions are largely renewals or extensions, but it's worth noting that one of the decisions that's currently proposed is a bit more proactive, giving the Secretariat a mandate to approach and work with states that are most active in trade of CITES species from the sea, including flags of convenience, states and territories. It's falling sort of in the same subject is one of the documents under NDFs submitted by the United Kingdom, which describes challenges and gaps in operationalization of international consultation. So, for example, what role can regional fisheries management organizations play for areas beyond national jurisdictions? And it proposes draft decisions to start a work stream on further recommendations and guidance for that. And the Secretariat points out that there is an NDF workshop planned for 2023, and that some of it might be taken up there. One of the Appendix 1 listed marine species that is also up for discussion at the COP is totoaba. Totoaba is a croaker fish that occurs with the most endangered marine mammal, the vaquita, in the northern Gulf of California. Totoaba they're both Appendix 1 listed. Totoaba is often taken illegally because the swim bladder is worth a lot of money, destined for Asian markets. And the Secretariat, the issue has been under review since CITES CoP19 in 2016. The Secretariat has now conducted a second mission to Mexico. Mexico also provides 6 monthly reports. The document summarizes them, and very generally, if I have to sum up, it would be that some progress was reported, but there are concerns about the enforcement of the zero tolerance area and the ban on gill nets. The Secretariat document itself proposes a renewal of the decisions with some minor updates, but there is also an alternative document submitted by the United States that proposes more strongly worded decisions, and the Secretariat in its comments said that it does not support going forward with that. Marine turtles is another Appendix 1 listed marine species that has been a recurring agenda item since COP12, so 20 years ago. Initially, there was a strong focus on hawksbill turtle in the Caribbean, but it was broadened to all species and regions since COP17. The Secretariat and Standing Committee report updates on a few decisions, one of the most interesting ones being a study on a link between bycatch and illegal trade in marine turtles, and proposes some draft decisions. There's an alternative proposal on the way forward by Brazil, Colombia, Costa Rica, Peru, and the United States that includes more of a focus on illegal trade and proposes a resolution. and the Secretariat in its comments supports the idea of a resolution and considers that some of the decisions in the first document can be also included in the resolution. Moving to sharks, as we have seen, there's a number of new sharks being proposed. There's also a number of commercially exploited sharks already listed. And one of the most interesting findings of the last 2 COP cycles has been that after the first larger listings entered into force in September 2014, the CITES Bay database did not record the amounts that experts would have expected. So COP18, based on findings of the Animals Committee and recommendation of the Animals Committee, adopted a decision 18221A, which basically translates to where are the missing sharks, finding out, investigating why there is a mismatch between what's recorded in the database and what experts would expect. And unfortunately, that decision was not implemented fully in this COP cycle. Traffic has conducted a study that looks at this from a qualitative angle, but it does not replace the study in decision 18221A. What is also interesting to note in that regard is that for mako shark, that is on the bottom right, the sort of light yellow, we're seeing for the first time somewhat realistic volumes being recorded in the CITES database. So definitely also some progress, but important to keep investing in the implementation and monitoring of these provisions. And leading into that, there's a document on seahorses. Seahorses were the first fully marine fish listed on CITES appendices at COP12. They went through several rounds of the review of significant trade, which is one of CITES' most powerful tools to facilitate compliance and implementation on the science side for Appendix 2 species. And so seahorses can offer quite a lot of potential learnings for other marine species. This workstream is based on a document submitted by Maldives, Monaco, Sri Lanka, and the United States at COP18 to look at some of the remaining implementation challenges and draw out some of those learnings. The document 69.1 is a standing committee report that basically states that some of the decisions were implemented, including background studies by Project Seahorse, but that an expert workshop is outstanding. Again, interesting to note, there is a separate document proposing an alternative way forward submitted by 8 parties, including the 4 countries that originally started the workstream or proposed to start the workstream, that provides additional decisions based on initial findings from the background studies. And again, the Secretariat noted in its comments that it does not support that way forward. Along similar lines, queen conch is a species that is regulated in CITES since 1992, and it is often highlighted as a success story. The working document at COP reports on discussions during the 4th and 5th meeting of the Regional Queen Conch Working Group. And it also reports on new work being conducted with UNCTAD and the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States on a joint project in the OECS region, which is a blue biotrade project. It's quite innovative, and I think it's worth pointing it out as a new development being presented to COP. One issue I wanted to pick out from the 4th and 5th meeting of the Regional Queen Conch Working Group is that there was a proposal to develop a resolution on queen conch, as it's been a recurring issue at many COPs. There's a lot of long-term guidance that could be codified in a resolution, and I think it will be interesting to keep an eye on whether or not something like that it will go forward. There's a number of additional working documents that I won't be able to go into detail about. Documents 45 on labeling system for training caviar, 61 on eels, and 80 on marine ornamental fish all report some progress on the respective COP18 decisions, but by and large, they propose renewal of the respective decisions with some minor tweaks. Document 46 on trade in stony corals is quite new and quite interesting technically, because it highlights some existing confusions with the special treatment of live rock under the convention, and it proposes amendments to the specific resolution dealing with this. There's also a number of cross-cutting issues here that I think are worth briefly mentioning. On the budget and work program for 2023 to 2025, it's great to see that there is a dedicated post on marine species being continued, given the continuously increasing workload on aquatic species, and it's been noted in many fora that having dedicated work and staff on these issues is important. On the review of the enforcement resolution 11.3, I wanted to highlight that one of the gaps that the Standing Committee Working Group identified in the last COP cycle is that it could be useful to streamline marine considerations throughout the resolution. And this is potentially something that the COP will adopt as work to be conducted in the next COP cycle, which in my personal view is overdue. Last but not least, on document 40, the guidance for making legal acquisition findings, it's worth noting that there was a legal acquisitions findings workshop just a month ago, and it had a breakout group on marine issues, and the document states that a revised rapid guide for the making of legal acquisition findings will be added as an addendum to the document. That isn't available yet, but it will be interesting to review also from a marine perspective. And just a quick conclusion, it's great to see that CITES parties continue to show trust in CITES' role in marine species by proposing new marine species under the convention. We can also see from the many working documents that CITES is making progress on overcoming implementation challenges where they are identified and improving coordination with fisheries stakeholders. And just to flag one very positive example, in my view, the biannual report by FAO, the State of the World Fisheries and Aquaculture, for the first time this year had, I believe, 1.5 or 2 pages explaining how CITES works, some of CITES history, and some of CITES mechanisms, which I think is incredibly hopeful. But more and continued long-term investment will be needed to make sure that the convention does its best for marine species. Thank you for your attention, and happy to also email me any questions you may have. Cheers.
Great, thank you, Daniel. That was really interesting. And also thank you for remembering our dear colleague, Fabio Hazin. I mean, COP16 in Bangkok would not have been the success it was without the contribution he made in the lead up to that COP and at the COP itself. You've also made it very clear why marine species are of growing importance under CITES, and we couldn't have had anyone better than to run us through these items. So thanks again. Now, not every issue on the CITES agenda attracts the headlines, but there is a lot of work that goes into implementing CITES. And we're delighted that Ruth Musgrave, the Director of Stockpile Management with the EPI Foundation, is with us today to take us through some of the working documents on species-specific matters, and in particular as they affect elephants. Over to you, Ruth.
Many thanks, John, and thank you, ADM, for the event. And hello, everybody. I'm trying to share my slides. That's working. So I'm going to focus on species-specific working documents relating to elephants and ones that include reference to stockpiles. I'm going to cluster the working documents rather than discuss each one in turn, as there is significant overlap. For elephants, they stem around Resolution 1010, which concerns the trade in elephant specimens and its implementation. First off, concerning the closure of domestic ivory markets, at COP19, there was a recommendation that was included into Resolution 1010 to urge the closure of domestic ivory markets that contribute to poaching or illegal trade. Parties that have not closed their domestic ivory markets were requested to report to the Secretariat what measures they are taking to ensure that the domestic ivory market does not contribute to the poaching on the legal ivory trade. Within working document 66.1, submitted by the Secretariat, it highlights that only 10 parties have reported to CITES on the status of their legality of their domestic ivory markets. And despite calls for reports at standing committees and other meetings, parties have not yet reported. And so in the annex of 6.1, the Secretariat proposes to push back the deadline for parties to submit their reports on the decision. This then ultimately pushes back the Secretariat's reports and recommendations to the COP. However, delaying the reporting deadline for parties does not necessarily mean more parties will report. Working document 66.3, which also covers domestic markets and submitted by 9 parties, proposes a new decision. This also includes pushing back the deadline for reporting, but also allows the Secretariat to use the parties' reports as well as other available external reports or documents which will be available. And so the Secretariat can compile the report about the impact of the open domestic markets, and this would thus prevent any delay in recommendations. Next up it was the trade in mammoth ivory, and again working document 66.1 by the Secretariat. The Secretariat was due to undertake a study relating to trade in mammoth ivory and its impact on the trade in elephant ivory. However, as funding was not secured and the work was not done, so the Secretariat has proposed a delay in this report and also requests to include external reports to compile the report, therefore reducing further delay on identifying impact. Next up was a trade in Asian elephants. After COP18, Asian elephant range states requested a report on progress to implement a decision 18226, which relates to preventing the illegal trade in Asian elephants, their parts and derivatives. Also on the development of strategy to manage captive elephant populations and the development of a system for registering, marking and tracing live Asian elephants. However, only 3 out of 13 Asian elephant range states reported to CITES. In Annex 3 of the working documents, 66.1 by the Secretariat, proposes amending the wording of the decision to refocus it towards elephant range states and delay the deadline for reporting. However, the wording might exclude countries that trade in Asian elephant or its derivatives, and therefore, but are not range states, and therefore the wording of the amendments may well be discussed on the floor at the CITES CoP. Next up is on stocks and stockpiles themselves. Resolution 1010 urges parties to have an inventory of their worked and raw ivory stockpiles held in government custody or significantly privately held stocks, and to report their ivory stockpiles to CITES each year by the 28th of February. This is really important for transparency and effective management of the seized goods. There are 3 documents relating to this aspect of Resolution 1010. First off is the document 66.1 submitted by the Secretariat and Annex 4. The Secretariat proposes new draft decisions to invite parties to submit tools which support practical guidance on ivory stockpile management. At the EPI Foundation, we have developed several tools, ivory stockpile tools, which are freely available and are cited in the CITES guidance note. And we are implementing them in supporting implementation in 15 African countries. They include a digital stockpile management system, inventory protocol, a reference document on the gold standards for ivory management with standard templated operating procedures for storeroom management, and also a storeroom assessment tool to identify weaknesses in the storeroom management system. We are holding a side event at the COP to provide more detail on this. With regards to the reporting of the stockpile societies each year, only 21 parties reported in 2021, and 44 parties have been identified that might have a stockpile but have not reported. In Annex 4, the Secretariat of 66.1, the Secretariat proposed delaying the Secretariat's report to identify these parties who have not reported to the 77th Standing Committee. Document 66.2.1, submitted by 10 parties, also relate to the stockpiles, and they propose a new form for the Declaration of Ivory Stocks and Inventory to facilitate compliance with Resolution 1010. This form, as currently drafted, is great, but it has a number of technical issues that should be addressed. The proposed decision also urges parties to consider if disposal as an option and to conduct specific training related to stockpile management aspects. This is very important, often overlooked. I'm now going to jump quickly to pangolins, as there are two working documents on pangolins that will have aspects relating to stockpile management. This is working on document 71.1, submitted by the Standing Committee and the Chair of the Annual Committee, and also 71.2, submitted by the UK, modifying the Resolution 1710. Within the working documents and the proposed text, they are aimed to strengthen the efforts to prevent the threats to and the illegal trade in pangolins. There is also mention of stockpiles, and it requests parties to secure the stockpiles of pangolin scales and report them to CITES. If we look holistically at document 71 and 66.1 and the form in 66.21, it seems that there are different stockpile reports being set up for different species. So it may be preferable for the parties to submit one consolidated stockpile report and form to CITES each year than multiple reports. This one report could include elephant, ivory, rhino horn, pangolin scales, and other Appendix 1 species as required. This will certainly reduce the administrative costs for the parties and CITES as well. Next up, relating to stockpiles, is a document submitted by Kenya, 66.2.1. This working document brings to attention the financial issues faced by parties all over the world to protect, manage, and conserve natural flora and fauna. The document outlines the benefits of disposal of ivory stockpiles, but also recognises the need for an incentive for parties to dispose of them. This working paper proposes setting up a CITES intersectional working group to discuss the option of a fund which would be available to countries which choose to destroy ivory stockpiles. Importantly, the document does make it clear that the funds would not be based on the volume of ivory destroyed. This is important, as if it was linked to the volume, it would be still putting a monetary figure on the value of ivory. One thing to note for this working document is it cites the GEF as a possible source of finance for this fund. However, the GEF is not a financial mechanism for CITES, it is for the CBD. And the CBD has a direct mandate for looking at conservation financing. And the CBD also looks beyond ivory. So perhaps this proposal could be included as part of the CBD COP19 discussions, which has a wider mandate than CITES, unless other sources of finances for the fund can be identified. The next aspect relating to 1010 is relates to the NEAP process. In document 66.1, the Secretariat provides an update to the countries involved in the NEAP process. But working document 66.7, submitted by Malawi, Senegal, and United States of America, explains the need and requests a complete review of the NEAP process. It is 10 years since the NEAP process had been launched, and there are concerns that it is not effective in achieving what it was set out to achieve. Another agenda item related to elephants, which will be probably discussed at length on the floor of the CITES CoP, relates to trade in live African elephants. As Mark will be speaking on live elephant trade next, I'll only mention this for sake of completeness. There are two working documents related to this. The current text in CITES on the trade in live African elephants is unclear and has resulted in different interpretations of the text. So in document 66.4.1, they have proposed to add text of resolution 1010 to resolve this, which states that the trade in live African elephants taken from the wild should be limited to in situ conservation programs or secure areas in the wild within the species' natural and historical range in Africa. This amendment to 1010 would still allow trade in live elephants, but only to a restricted area. The EU and the member states, on the other hand, in working document 66.4.2, want a workable framework for the trade in live African elephants and agrees the current language within CITES is confusing. The EU's working document highlights in depth the complexity relating to the text on the trade in live elephants within the current appendices, annotations, and resolutions, which certainly needs tidying up. It proposes the Standing Committee to provide clarification and guidance on how to resolve the matter. And they also suggest a dialogue meeting is held within African range states to agree a harmonious approach to the conditions under which live elephants could be traded. And finally, there's two information documents. So 66.5 is a report on monitoring illegal killing of elephants prepared by the Secretariat. As normal, this very informative document on the trends in illegal killing of elephants as an index of poaching pressure In Africa, the annual continental pike estimate was showing as a decrease from 2011 to 2020, indicating a decrease in poaching pressure. But 2021 saw a slight increase in the pike estimate. This increase was significantly more in West and Central Africa, and this implies an increase in poaching pressure to elephants. And looking at the figures, there is still a concerning proportion of illegally killed elephants. In Asia, the continental pike remains relatively stable, with a slight decrease in 2021. However, this might be due to the number of sites reporting has been decreased. And finally, on the ETIS report on the working document 6.6, prepared by the Secretariat, this informative document on the elephant trade information system shows the data up to 2020. As you can see, there's a massive drop in seizures reported in 2020. However, this is most likely due to the impact of COVID, with fewer operations, fewer people traveling, restrictions to international travel. So it's most likely an anomaly. If you look at 2029, this was the third largest seizure year for seizures in terms of total weight. So it'll be interesting to see what the results are for 2021 and 2022 as COVID restrictions have eased. This report also highlights that West Africa and Central Africa remain hotspots for poaching for elephants, which corresponds to the MITE report. Thank you very much. I hope that was of interest. And I'll pass it back to you, John.
Many thanks, Ruth, and absolutely of interest. And thanks very much. You had a lot to get through there, and you've helped untangle a whole number of interrelated issues. Very clear, and thank you very much. Now, for our final expert speakers today, we will turn our attention to zoonotic disease emergence, special trade provisions, captive breeding, trade in live animals, and livelihoods issues. And we have two experts with deep experience in these issues to guide us through them. We'll firstly hear from Dr. Mark Jones, who is a veterinarian and the head of policy with the Born Free Foundation. And then he will pass directly to Professor Dalia Conde, the Director of Science with Species 360. And she's going to introduce us to some groundbreaking research she has been leading on trade in certain wild animals and the risk it may pose to human health. Over to you, Mark.
Many thanks, John. I'm just going to see if I can share my screen. And I hope you can hear me okay.
Yes, we can.
Great. Okay. Yeah. Many thanks, John. Many thanks, ADMCF and the co-sponsors for this opportunity to speak to you all today. As John says, I work as head of policy at the UK-based international wildlife protection charity Born Free. We've got a long-standing interest and involvement in CITES and wildlife trade issues, both in our own right and as members of the Species Survival Network of wildlife protection organisations. And I'm going to talk briefly on three subjects of particular interest to Born Free that will form a big part of the discussions that are going to happen at COP19, namely participation and livelihoods, the whole issue of trade in live animals, and zoonoses and the role of CITES in preventing zoonotic disease emergence. So starting with participation and livelihoods, there are a number of documents relating to these issues on the COP19 agenda. Document 13 on engagement of Indigenous peoples and local communities proposes the continuation of ongoing work to develop guidance that parties may use in consulting with Indigenous peoples and local communities and how to effectively engage these groups in the CITES processes. Document 14 on livelihoods proposes the continuation of work aimed at establishing how sustainable use of society's listed species contributes to the livelihoods of IPLCs and to species conservation. Document 15 on participatory mechanisms for rural communities in CITES proposes the establishment of a rural communities advisory subcommittee to provide advice to the CITES COP and Secretariat on wildlife trade issues in order to assess the potential social and economic impacts of CITES decisions on rural communities and promote community-based programs. The subcommittee would have the ability to draft resolutions and decisions for consideration by the Conference of the Parties. And as Craig has already described, document 87.1 on proposed amendments to Res Conf 9.24, that's the resolution that lays down the criteria for species listings, proposes that in order to qualify for listing in Appendix 1 or 2, species must meet livelihood and food security criteria in addition to conservation and wildlife trade considerations. animals, and that international trade should be the primary driver for population decline if species are to be listed. Now, on the face of it, these may seem like perfectly reasonable proposals. Indigenous peoples and local communities are clearly a vital constituency whose views should be fully taken into account at international forums such as CITES, particularly when their livelihoods might be affected. Nevertheless, I think we need to remember the Convention's stated aim, which is to ensure that international trade in specimens of wild animals and plants does not threaten the survival of species. Declines in wild species because of over-exploitation for trade and the associated disruption of biodiversity is in nobody's long-term interests, particularly those who live closest to and rely directly on wildlife and ecosystem resources for their subsistence. The incorporation of socioeconomic factors into CITES listing decisions or other decision-making processes could seriously undermine the Convention's core remit. So the kind of proposals included in document 87.1 could prove to be very controversial at the COP. It's also not entirely clear who would represent Indigenous and local community groups on the subcommittee proposed in document 15, what its mandate would be, how it would be funded, and how geographic balance would be achieved. A similar proposal was put forward at COP17 in 2016, but was rejected by the parties. Of course, community groups already have the right to participate in CITES processes as observers in the same way that any civil society representatives do. And there are dangers in elevating the status of any one group of observers over others. Some parties have also incorporated Indigenous representation into their official delegations, as they absolutely have the right to do. Nevertheless, CITES is a treaty between state parties, and elevating one stakeholder or observer group to committee level sets a potentially dangerous precedent and creates potential imbalances in the CITES system. Of course, governments can and should take account of the impacts of CITES processes on livelihoods during national stakeholder engagement on implementation, as is already mandated in ResComp 16.6 on CITES and livelihoods. Issues regarding Indigenous peoples and local communities, their livelihoods and wildlife associated value chains are also of great interest to the Convention on Biological Diversity, which has a specific remit relating to the sustainable use of the components of biological diversity and the equitable sharing of benefits arising from that use. So aspects of these issues will be contentious at COP19. And they also reflect the need for close collaboration between the major international biodiversity conventions. Moving to trade in live animals, as John said at the very start, CITES is a trade and conservation focused convention, really designed to ensure that international trade in wildlife doesn't threaten the survival of the species. It's not a welfare-focused convention designed in some way to reduce harm to individual wild animals. The two things are not synonymous. Nevertheless, CITES does contain a number of provisions that relate to the welfare of animals that are traded live. The convention text itself requires states of export to be satisfied that living specimens are so prepared and shipped as to minimize the risk of injury, damage to health, or cruel treatment. It also requires states of import to ensure that the recipient of a living specimen is suitably equipped to house and care for it. And among its resolutions and guidelines, CITES also provides some guidance to parties on how these requirements should be met and how other aspects of the management of live CITES listed animals in trade, such as transport, live animal confiscations, and captive breeding of CITES species for commercial purposes, should be accomplished. Some key aspects of live trade in CITES listed species will be up for discussion at COP19. Agenda item 48 invites parties to approve best practice guidance documents that have been drafted to assist parties in determining whether proposed recipients of live African elephants and southern white rhinos are suitably equipped to house and care for them, and how to determine whether such trade would promote in situ conservation. Agenda item 50 reports that the CITES Secretariat has developed a dedicated webpage with resources and information on live animal confiscations and how they should be managed, and provides revised decisions that invite parties and stakeholders to submit information and resources to the Secretariat on this issue, so the Standing Committee can make further recommendations in the future. Agenda item 52 follows on from the recent updating of the CITES guidance on non-air transport of live specimens and provides draft decisions directing the Animals and Plants Committees to convene a workshop to share best practices relating to live animal transport. In addition, it directs the Secretariat to work with the International Air Transport Association, or IATA, to make relevant sections of its live animal regulations and perishable cargo regulations freely available to CITES authorities who currently have to pay quite a substantial fee to obtain them. It also provides draft amendments to the CITES resolution on transport of live specimens, encouraging parties to apply IATA rules and the CITES guidance on non-air transport to both domestic and international portions of CITES transports. Agenda item 54 suggests amendments to the resolution that details the process by which CITES examines the validity of claims that listed species in trade are captive bred. Now, this is a relatively new process, but it's important because CITES rules allows for commercial trade in Appendix 1 species bred in captivity. So it's really vital that parties have confidence in claims of captive breeding. Agenda item 55 is related to this and is aimed at strengthening the process by which captive breeding operations for Appendix 1 species are registered and identifying which species or products they should be allowed to trade in. And agenda item 66.4, as already covered by Ruth in previous presentation, concerns the long-standing controversy around the international trade in wild-caught live African elephants. Some 216 individual wild-caught elephants have been exported to zoos over roughly the past decade from some southern African countries. The fact that African elephants are split listed between Appendix 1 and Appendix 2, with the southern African Appendix 2 population subject to an annotation that confers differing restrictions on different populations, means that there are effectively 3 different sets of rules in place covering trade in live wild-caught elephants, depending on the country of origin of the animals concerned. And of course, those animals may cross borders, so the rules that apply to an individual animal may change as they move about during their migrations. This has resulted in controversial interpretation of the rules by some parties to facilitate continued trade in live elephants. At its 74th meeting earlier this year, the Standing Committee invited parties to propose a clear legal framework for trade in live African elephants. And to that end, a number of elephant range countries are proposing an addition to the existing resolution on trade in elephant specimens, ResConf 1010, that would restrict the export of live wild-caught elephants to in situ conservation programs or secure areas in the wild within the species' natural and historic range in Africa. And this reflects the IUCN African Elephant Specialist Group's position and that of most African range states. In addition to these technical discussions, COP19 will be asked to consider 21 proposals to introduce or increase regulation of trade for some 239 species of reptiles and amphibians. Many of these species are traded live to supply the demand in exotic pet markets around the world. So as a wildlife protection organisation with a strong animal welfare focus, we'll be calling for support for the adoption of progressive measures to protect the welfare of live CITES listed animals in trade. And finally, I'd like to touch on the role of CITES in reducing the risk of future zoonotic diseases. I think the COVID-19 pandemic, with its likely origins in wild animals, has brought home the devastating consequences of emerging zoonoses for human health and well-being and for the global economy. And the trade in and trafficking of wildlife is an important potential risk factor for the emergence and transmission of zoonotic pathogens. So CITES, as the international wildlife trade regulator, clearly has some kind of role to play in mitigating future risk alongside other international and national bodies. And to some extent, I think the world will be anticipating CITES' response at COP19. To this end, the CITES Standing Committee established an intersessional working group back in 2021, whose work has led to a number of draft decisions for consideration by COP19, which can be found in document 23.1. The recommendations would task the Secretariat with a number of activities, including gathering information from parties on domestic measures taken to mitigate the risk of pathogen spillover from international wildlife trade, developing a joint programme of work with the World Organization for Animal Health on solutions for reducing spillover risk in wildlife supply chains, identifying future opportunities for reducing risk, and reporting to the CITES committees and COP20. The recommendations also provide amendments to Resolution Conf 1021 on transport of live specimens in order to incorporate measures to reduce the risk of pathogen transmission during live animal transport. However, during the discussions at the Standing Committee last March, concerns were expressed by several parties about the need for urgency, given the potential consequences of future emerging zoonoses. The recommendations in the Standing Committee's document would defer the development of a specific CITES resolution on pandemic risk mitigation to COP20, which will probably take place in 2025, which many parties and observers feel lacks the urgency required by the situation. So a group of 7 West and Central African parties have proposed that CITES adopt a new resolution at COP19 entitled One Health and CITES, Reducing Human and Animal Health Risks from International Wildlife Trade. The draft resolution and associated decisions can be found in COP19 Doc 23.2. And the draft resolution and decisions recommend that parties should adopt a One Health approach when implementing the convention, particularly in respect of live animals in trade and in regulating captive breeding and the transport of live animals, that parties should develop associated One Health CITES action plans, and that the Secretariat and CITES committees should create a CITES One Health expert panel and a dedicated webpage to help guide parties in implementing the resolution and conducting the necessary risk assessments. The adoption of the draft resolution would encourage CITES authorities to initiate measures as a matter of urgency to mitigate the risk of future pandemics resulting from zoonotic pathogen emergence and disease transmission from wildlife trade, and to use the intersessional period following COP19 to evaluate the implementation and effectiveness of these measures and revise them as appropriate. So at that point, I'd like to hand over to Professor Dalia Conde, Director of Science at Species 360, who's going to describe her work to help establish how the risks of future zoonoses emerging from wildlife trade might be assessed.
Thank you for the introduction, John. I am with the Species 360, a global data-driven nonprofit organization, and we have more than 1,200 members around the world that share standardized records through the zoological information management systems. This is a database with actually millions of veterinary and husbandry records of the animals under human care. And our members include that share data include zoos, aquariums, rescue centers, and wildlife sanctuaries. Zoonotic diseases. Well, with the devastating effects of COVID and the confirmation that its emergence came from a wet market, from wildlife, have highlighted the importance of a One Health approach for pandemics prevention. Given the nature of our organization as a data-driven and nonprofit, and given this crisis, we are analyzing the relationship between potential species hosts of this list of blueprint diseases with the international wildlife trade. But as well, we want to assess how our members' records and the expertise of hundreds of veterinarians and scientists can support preventive measures. We chose this list of diseases because the blueprint have been prioritized by the World Health Organization because these diseases can cause a pandemic or an epidemic for which a cure does not exist. As well, we wanted to identify the number of species hosts through the Enhanced Infectious Diseases database. We chose this database that is managed and developed by the University of Liverpool, with whom we are collaborating for this project, because it's continually updating which species have been identified to susceptible to the pathogens of hundreds of thousands of diseases, and it includes diseases that can jump from animals to humans. And we found that of all these hundreds of thousands of species, there are 197 species hosts. And in addition, we were able to assess which is the certainty that these species can carry or host these diseases. And the certainty we measure based if it's a serological, a PCR, or an isolation test, with serological being the lowest certainty, which is equivalent to the swab test that you make when you are not sure if you have COVID, and if it's positive, usually you go for a PCR. Once we had this analysis, the next step is how many of these species have movement through the international wildlife trade that is illegal, and for how many we can identify records in the illegal trade. So we pulled data from these databases, and for both the legal and illegal wildlife trade, and assessed how many of these species overlap. And overall, we identified that there are at least 58% of the species that are potential hosts are internationally traded. And we assessed that their movement across the world. And as the WHO negotiations on pandemics, prevention, preparedness, and response are advancing to create a multilateral instrument, Species 360 members can actually support with key information we found for at least 60% of the potential species is host. This can be through information, through the expertise of hundreds of veterinarians that work in all those organizations, but as well as we expand our membership with rescue centers, we can even in the future help governments to monitor priority diseases and its relationship with the international wildlife trade. So I want to mention that the fact that we found that at least half, or at least 58%, more than half of the species hosts of critical diseases, such as the blueprint, are in the international wildlife trade. The instruments on pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response that the WHO is coordinating, it will be essential to consider the international wildlife trade. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Set aside for questions and answers, and very much appreciate the comments that have been submitted through the Q&A function. As I said, because we were going to have limited time, colleagues online together with myself have been working to answer those questions, and we have managed to answer a lot. But there are a few that were answered, I think, that could be worthwhile picking up in the open Q&A. And there was one that got quite a few thumbs up that I wanted to ask, because it was quite an interesting question, and it came from Jennifer Crows. And she asked whether or not by any chance domesticated species, for example, donkeys, can be considered for species. And she makes reference to why she thinks that would be a good idea. There was a number of people liking it. And Craig, I see that you offered an answer, and perhaps if you could just give us an answer now, orally, that would be very helpful.
Sorry, John, can you repeat that question just one more time for me?
Yes, it's the question about any chance domesticated species, such as donkeys, could be listed. And I see you answered in the Q&A function, but it's one that attracted a lot of interest. So
yeah, it's an interesting question. And the short answer I would say is yes, because if you look across the appendices, you will see listings that explicitly exclude domesticated forms or domesticated species, which suggests that if you didn't exclude them, they would be covered. And I would note that at a recent COP, a party actually put forward a proposal to list an extinct species. Again, because of the potential for lookalike issues where the specimens in trade are similar or difficult to differentiate from other listed species. So I would think that there is a path forward potentially for a party to put forward a proposal to list a domesticated species, particularly because of its similarity of appearance to another listed species?
Great, thanks, Craig. That was a very interesting question, and thanks for picking up on that. I see that Kim Friedman, who works with FAO, has thrown in a question that's got in a few likes there as well. And Daniel, you may want to pick this one up. Can an annotation talk to wild versus hatchery reared specimens of the same species? And I've read his question out directly. Perhaps you could tackle that one for us. Are you there, Daniel? Here he is.
Sorry, I saw that Craig had his camera on, and I think he provided very wise counsel on that question, that there are a number of innovative ways that parties use annotations. I am not immediately familiar with an example where it has been used for marine species in that way. But I'm also not aware of why it would not be possible to do it. Craig, anything to add from your side?
Yeah, I would just note, as I did in the chat, that I think it's dangerous territory to suggest that there are limitations on annotations because the parties keep pushing beyond those bounds. But certainly if you look across the annotations, you'll see, for example, reference to quotas that specify the particular source of a specimen. So I do think that there are a number of ways that one could tackle the issue of a captive versus a wild source in an annotation or in reference to a specific quota that limits what can and cannot be in trade under CITES.
Good, thank you for that. And I wonder, I know that Jonathan had to duck out for a while, but Jonathan, are you there by any chance? If so, if you could flick your camera on. I see that we have...
I'm here, John.
Good on you, Jonathan. We have a number of questions that have come forward asking about a whole variety of IUCN resolutions. I might throw this one to you as well, Michael, and asking about what are the relevance of IUCN resolutions to CITES and CITES decision making. So Jonathan, to you, and then a quick comment from Michael.
What can I say? IUCN is an observer organisation in CITES, so that they can also make contributions. But of course, IUCN has lots of members who are also observers at CITES. They don't have any special, how can I say, special status within CITES. So, but the information that's provided by IUCN is obviously extremely valuable. They have tremendous expertise, and they can contribute to the discussion just as anybody else can.
Mm-hmm. Yep, very good. Thank you, Jonathan. And Michael, you're with the IUCN specialist group on turtle and tortoises. Anything to add there?
Because IUCN has got a lot of scientific expertise across the world. So quite often through the research or through their monitoring, they would know the status of the species concerned or even the trends. And those information would be very useful to beef up the CITES proposals.
Very good. Thank you for that, Michael. Now, I'm very conscious of the time. I'm very appreciative of the fact that we've had so many people stay with us throughout the course of today. Might I say that we're very disappointed that Dahlia didn't have the opportunity to join us live, but we will correct that with the video recording. We will capture what Dahlia hoped to say, and we will build it into the video so that it's not missed, and we will be able to capture it in another way. So disappointing, Dahlia, but don't worry, we'll find another way of addressing that. As I said, we've tried to answer all of your questions as we could going along. We haven't got to all of them, but we will find a way to respond to them over the coming days, and Sophie will announce something about that shortly. Okay. Colleagues, we're getting to the end of today's briefing session. It's been a wonderful briefing session. I hope it has left you with a clearer understanding of how a CITES CoP works and what to expect. One of the legacies of COVID is that we all became familiar with the technology we're using today, And it's that technology that has enabled us to provide this global experts briefing. We were delighted that over 1,000 people pre-registered for today's event. At the start, we had around 520 people join us, and we've stayed over 300 throughout the course of today. Really appreciate all of you joining us online. If today's event has been seen as a success, perhaps it could set a precedent for CITES and other conventions to follow into the future. I'd like to most sincerely thank all of our expert speakers. They've shared their knowledge and expertise so willingly with all of us today. Our 12 co-sponsoring organisations for their support, ADM Capital Foundation for hosting today's event so brilliantly, our very efficient Zoom manager, as well as our excellent interpreters. Finally, and I'm repeating myself a bit here, but a big thank you to all of you who've joined us online. Having so many people pre-register and join us today has made all of the effort that went into putting today's event on feel worthwhile. And now it's my great pleasure to hand the floor back to Sophie to make her closing remarks for the host organisation and to make an announcement about next steps. Over to you, Sophie.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much. In closing, I'd just really like to echo John, thank all of our speakers, both for giving their time and sharing their expert views and perspectives. Also like to thank all of the event sponsors, and especially John for his deft moderation, without which this event really would not have been possible. And of course, the interpreters and everybody behind the event. But as John also said, most of all, we would like to thank you all for listening and for participating. We weren't able to deal with all the questions today, but we really value all the input. So to answer those questions and to carry on the conversation, we're launching a dedicated platform. So the Twitter handle @CITES50 is now live, and will provide an opportunity for all interested parties, whether CITES experts, practitioners, or individuals, to engage, carry on today's discussion, and exchange perspectives in the run-up to the CITES reaching its 50th anniversary in March next year. Our experts here today will be on hand to actively engage in and join that discussion. So it just remains for me to close the webinar. Thank you all again, and of course, see you in Panama. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie. Goodbye all. Thank you.
Goodbye. Good night.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.